It was a typical Tuesday at Mercy Hospital in Chicago when Sarah Mitchell rushed through the emergency room's automatic door, carrying her 3-year-old son, Jacob, in her arms. The boy was pale, with bluish lips and half-closed eyes, breathing with difficulty. The receptionist barely had time to grab the registration clipboard before Sarah screamed for immediate help. 2 nurses rushed to her and quickly placed Jacob on a stretcher. Dr. Marcus Chen, an experienced pediatrician with 15 years of practice, took over the case immediately. He examined the boy and noticed something alarming in his vital signs. His oxygen saturation was dangerously low, and the child showed signs of acute poisoning. Sarah explained between sobs that Jacob had drunk something under the kitchen sink while she was on a phone call. The medical protocol was activated instantly. The team began administering intravenous fluids and attempted to stabilize the small patient. Dr. Chen ordered urgent toxicology tests to identify the ingested substance. Meanwhile, Sarah remained by her son's side, holding his cold little hand and praying silently. She couldn't stop blaming herself for those seconds of distraction that almost cost Jacob his life. The following hours were an emotional roller coaster. The test results came back, confirming that Jacob had ingested a significant amount of ammonia-based cleaning product. The situation was critical. The poison had already begun to corrode his esophagus and was affecting his kidneys. The medical team mobilized with maximum urgency. Toxicology specialists were called in, and an emergency room was prepared for possible more invasive interventions. Dr. Chen explained to Sarah that they would need to perform an immediate gastric lavage, but there were risks involved due to Jacob's fragile state. The mother signed the consent forms with hands trembling so much she could barely hold the pen. She asked if her son would survive, and the doctor replied with brutal honesty that they would do everything within the reach of modern medicine, but they couldn't guarantee anything. The team took Jacob to the operating room. Sarah stood outside, pacing back and forth in the hallway, unable to sit or stand still. She called her husband, Robert, who was on a business trip in New York. He said he would take the first flight back, but it would take at least 4 hours to arrive. Sarah had never felt so alone and desperate in her life. Inside the operating room, the team worked with surgical precision. Every second counted. Dr. Chen coordinated the movements of 5 professionals simultaneously, giving clear orders and constantly monitoring Jacob's vital signs. Gastric lavage was initiated. The procedure was delicate and painful, even with the child sedated. They needed to remove as much of the venom as possible, without causing further damage to the already compromised tissues. During the procedure, Jacob suffered cardiac arrest. The monitor. Alarms went off, and the team went into cardiopulmonary resuscitation mode. Dr. Chen began chest compressions, while a nurse prepared the defibrillator. They applied the first shock. Nothing. Second shock. The heart remained unresponsive. The tension in the room was palpable. Every professional there knew they were racing against time, and that every second without a heartbeat meant possible, irreversible brain damage. On the third shock, Jacob's heart started beating again. A collective sigh of relief filled the room, but there was no time for celebration. They needed to complete the gastric lavage and stabilize the patient before another complication arose. Dr. Emily Rodriguez, a pediatric toxicology specialist who had just arrived, took over part of the procedure and brought new treatment strategies. She suggested using an experimental antidote that had shown promising results in similar cases in Europe. The protocol wasn't officially approved in the United States, but there was a legal loophole for compassionate use in life-threatening situations. Dr. Chen hesitated for only 3 seconds before authorizing it. They had no better options. The medication was administered slowly through the intravenous line. The next 20 minutes would be crucial in determining whether Jacob's body would respond positively, or if there would be an adverse reaction that could further worsen the situation. The team maintained constant vigilance, checking every change on the monitors, every change in skin color, every breathing pattern. Gradually, miraculously, the vital signs began to improve. Oxygen saturation rose from 62% to 78%, then to 85%. Blood pressure stabilized. The bluish discoloration of the lips began to fade, giving way to a healthier pinkish hue. It was like watching life return to that child's body, cell by cell, beat by beat. Dr. Chen emerged from the procedure room 2 hours after it had started and found Sarah exactly where he had left her, still walking down the hallway. His gaze said it all before the words even left his mouth. Jacob had survived the critical phase. Sarah fell to her knees right there on the cold hospital floor, covering her face with her hands and crying with relief. The doctor helped her to her feet and took her to a private room where he explained in detail everything that had happened. Jacob was not yet completely out of danger. He would need to remain under intensive observation for at least 72 hours. There was damage to his esophagus and possibly his kidneys that would need to be monitored. Reconstructive surgeries might be necessary in the future, but he was alive and fighting. Sarah was allowed to see her son 30 minutes later, when she entered the pediatric intensive care unit and saw Jacob connected to so many tubes and machines. Her heart ached again. He looked so small, so fragile in that hospital bed. She approached slowly and gently touched his hair. Tears welled up again, but this time they were tears of gratitude. Robert arrived at the hospital shortly after midnight. He rushed into the ICU, still wearing his rumpled suit from the trip. When he saw Jacob, his legs gave way, and he had to lean against the wall. Sarah went to him, and the two embraced for long minutes, saying nothing, just feeling the shared weight of that terrible moment. The first night was the hardest. Jacob had a high fever and seizures due to temporary neurological damage, caused by lack of oxygen during the cardiac arrest. The medical team quickly intervened with anticonvulsant medication. Sarah and Robert took turns at the bedside, one always awake while the other tried to rest in the uncomfortable chair in the room. On the second day, Jacob opened his eyes for the first time. He was confused and scared, not understanding where he was or why he was in so much pain. Sarah held his hand and spoke softly, explaining that he was in the hospital, but that he would be all right soon. Jacob tried to speak, but the tubes in his throat prevented him. He began to get agitated, and the monitors went off again. A nurse rushed in and administered a mild sedative to calm the boy. She explained to the parents that this reaction was normal and that Jacob needed rest to recover. His body had suffered severe trauma and needed time to heal. Patience would be the key word in the coming weeks. Dr. Chen visited Jacob 3 times a day. He had developed a special affection for the boy, as occasionally happened with some patients. There was something about Jacob's fight for life that deeply touched the doctor. Perhaps because Dr. Chen also had a son of the same age at home. Perhaps because this case reminded him of why he had chosen medicine in the first place. On the 3rd day, tests showed that Jacob's kidneys were recovering better than expected. The experimental antidote had worked beyond the most optimistic expectations. Kidney function was gradually returning to normal. The esophagus still showed significant burns, but not as extensive as doctors had initially feared. There would certainly be scarring, but perhaps reconstructive surgery would not be necessary. Dr. Rodriguez was impressed by the recovery. She began documenting the case in detail for publication in a medical journal. If that antidote had worked so well on Jacob, it could save countless other children in the future. She asked Sarah and Robert for permission to use Jacob's case as a reference study. They immediately agreed, hopeful that their son's suffering might have some greater significance. On the 4th day, the breathing tubes were removed. Jacob was able to speak for the first time, although his voice was hoarse and weak. The first word he said was, "Mommy." Sarah broke down in tears again. She hugged her son carefully so as not to hurt his wounds, and whispered in his ear that she loved him more than anything in the world. Jacob asked if he had done something wrong. That question broke Sarah's heart into 1,000 pieces. She explained that no, he hadn't done anything wrong, that it had just been an accident. She promised him that when they returned home, they would put safety locks on all the cupboards, and that nothing like that would ever happen again. Robert spoke with the doctors about prevention. Dr. Chen recommended that they seek a child safety specialist as soon as Jacob was discharged from the hospital. Statistics showed that more than 50,000 children were hospitalized annually in the United States due to accidental poisoning. Most cases could be prevented with simple safety measures. On the 5th day, Jacob was transferred from the ICU to a regular room. It was a huge step in the right direction. He was still weak and needed constant care, but the worst was over. Sarah decorated the room with colorful drawings and balloons. Robert brought Jacob's favorite teddy bear from home. A routine began to settle in the hospital room. Nurses came and went regularly to check vital signs and administer medications. Physical therapists began light sessions to help Jacob regain muscle strength. Nutritionists developed a special meal plan tailored to the needs of his damaged esophagus. Jacob was initially on a completely liquid diet. Each meal was carefully monitored. Sarah held the spoon and helped him take small sips of nutritious broth. It was a slow and sometimes frustrating process, but each sip represented progress. Jacob complained that he wanted to eat pizza and hamburgers like before, and Sarah promised that soon, very soon, he would be able to. On the 6th day, Jacob took his first steps since the accident. With Sarah supporting him on one side and a physical therapist on the other, he managed to walk from his bed to the window of his room. It was only 6 meters, but it felt like a marathon. Jacob was breathless and exhausted when he got there, but there was a small smile on his face. Through the window, they could see the hospital parking lot, and, beyond it, a small square with trees. Jacob pointed to the birds flying among the branches and said he wanted to go outside. Sarah promised that as soon as the doctors gave permission, they would go together to feed the birds. Jacob said that looked good. On the 7th day, something unexpected happened. Jacob had an allergic reaction to one of the antibiotics he was taking. His face swelled up, and red spots appeared all over his body. The alarms went off again, and Sarah felt the panic return. The medical team acted quickly, stopping the medication and administering strong antihistamines. It was another scare, another emotional roller coaster, but the reaction was brought under control in less than an hour. Dr. Chen explained that it was relatively common to develop allergies to medications during prolonged treatments. They would switch to a different antibiotic and continue monitoring closely. Sarah realized at that moment how much life had changed since the accident. Before, she worried about trivial things like traffic, work deadlines, or whether the lawn needed mowing. Now, her only concern was seeing Jacob breathe, seeing his heartbeat, seeing him open his eyes each morning. All those other things seemed completely irrelevant. Robert took indefinite leave from work. His boss had been understanding and said that family always came first. Robert spent his mornings at the hospital with Jacob while Sarah went home to shower, change clothes, and try to get some rest. Then they switched shifts, and Robert dealt with bills, health insurance calls, and other practical matters. On the 8th day, Jacob asked to draw. A nurse brought paper and crayons. Jacob drew his family, 3 stick figures holding hands under a bright yellow sun. Sarah kept that drawing as if it were the most precious treasure in the world. It represented hope. It represented the future. It represented that Jacob was still a child, despite everything he had been through. The following days brought consistent and gradual improvements. Jacob began to eat soft foods. His voice grew stronger. The scars on his esophagus were healing better than expected. His kidneys showed virtually normal function. Each test brought good news. Each day was a small victory. On the 12th day, Dr. Chen announced that Jacob could be discharged from the hospital soon. He would still need frequent medical follow-up and medication for a few months, but he could continue his recovery at home. Sarah and Robert could hardly believe it. After almost 2 weeks living in the hospital, the idea of going home seemed surreal. They received detailed instructions about home care. A pediatric nurse would visit the house 3 times a week. Jacob would need checkups every 2 weeks. His diet would have to be carefully controlled for at least another 2 months. But he would be at home, in his own bed, surrounded by his toys and the love of his family. On the day of his discharge, the entire medical team came to say goodbye to Jacob. He had won everyone's hearts. Nurses brought a teddy bear dressed in a doctor's coat. Dr. Chen gave Jacob a toy stethoscope and said that maybe one day he would be a real doctor. Jacob laughed and said he would rather be a firefighter, but that he would keep the stethoscope with affection. The drive back home was quiet and emotional. Robert drove slowly, careful of every curve and every speed bump. Sarah sat in the back seat, next to Jacob, holding his hand the whole time. Jacob looked out the window, observing the world outside as if it were the first time. The colors seemed more vibrant, the sky bluer, everything more beautiful. When they got home, Jacob ran to his room despite Sarah asking him to slow down. He wanted to see all his toys, his bed, his books. Everything was exactly as he had left it, but somehow it felt different. Perhaps because he himself was different after everything he had been through. Sarah and Robert spent the rest of the day installing safety locks on every cupboard, every drawer, every door that could pose a danger. They bought poison detectors and organized all the chemicals in a locked cabinet in the garage, out of reach of children. They would never allow an accident like that to happen again. That first night at home, Sarah barely slept. She woke up every hour to check if Jacob was breathing, if he was comfortable, if he needed anything. Robert also slept little. They were both exhausted, but couldn't switch off that part of their brains that remained in high alert mode. The following weeks were about adjustment and learning. Jacob had occasional nightmares about the hospital. He would wake up crying and calling for his mother. Sarah would calm him down, sing lullabies, and stay by his side until he fell asleep again. A child therapist was hired to help Jacob process the trauma of the accident. Feeding him continued to be a challenge. Jacob refused to eat certain foods because they hurt to swallow. Sarah had to be creative, preparing nutritious soups and tasty smoothies that wouldn't irritate his still sensitive esophagus. Gradually, week after week, the diet was expanded. Follow-up examinations showed continued recovery. The esophagus was healing well. There would be a permanent scar, but it shouldn't cause long-term functional problems. The kidneys were completely normal again. It was a medical miracle, the experts said. Few patients with such severe poisoning recovered so completely. 3 months after the accident, Jacob returned to kindergarten. Sarah was nervous, but knew it was important for him to resume a normal life. She spoke at length with the teachers about what had happened and about special care. Everyone promised to be attentive and help Jacob readjust. On the first day of school, Jacob was excited, but also anxious. He hugged Sarah tightly before entering the classroom and made her promise to come back for him. Sarah promised, and watched from the window until he disappeared among the other students. She spent the entire day restless, checking the clock every 5 minutes. When she went to pick him up at the end of the day, Jacob ran out of school with a drawing in his hand. He had drawn a superhero with a red cape. Sarah asked who it was, and Jacob replied that it was himself, the boy who had overcome the poison. Sarah hugged her son so tightly she could barely breathe. Her brave little warrior. Life, gradually, returned to normal, but nothing would be the same as before. Sarah had quit her job to dedicate herself entirely to caring for Jacob. Robert took on more responsibilities at work to compensate for her loss of income. The family's priorities had changed completely. What truly mattered now was crystal clear. Sarah began giving talks at schools and community centers about child home safety. She shared Jacob's story, showed photos and statistics, and taught other mothers how to prevent accidents. Each family she helped raise awareness seemed to give more meaning to the suffering they had endured. Jacob grew strong and healthy, despite the invisible and visible scars he would carry forever. He became a more cautious child, but not fearful. He understood dangers in a way that other children did not. He had a different kind of maturity in his eyes, a consequence of having faced death head-on when he was only 3 years old. Years later, when Jacob was 8 years old, the family received a letter from Dr. Rodriguez. The experimental antidote that had saved his life was now being used in hospitals across the country. Hundreds of children had been saved using the protocol developed from Jacob's case. He had been the first, the unwitting pioneer who paved the way for others. Sarah read the letter aloud during dinner, and everyone cried tears of joy. Jacob asked if that meant he was a hero. Robert said yes, that he was the greatest hero he knew. Jacob smiled that smile that lit up his whole face, and said he was happy to have helped other children even without knowing it. That night, Sarah went to Jacob's room after he fell asleep. She looked at the boy she had almost lost, that miracle sleeping peacefully, hugging his teddy bear. She remembered that terrible day at the hospital, the race against time, the despair she felt when she thought she would lose her son forever. But he was there, alive, breathing, dreaming, and every day since then had been a gift she would never take for granted. Every laugh from Jacob, every hug, every bedtime story was a precious treasure. Life had given the Mitchell family a second chance, and they would never forget it.